And cutting through all that noise was the eerie, reverberating sound of bullets hitting bayonets. Raising his eyes, Raju saw that they were now very close to the walls of the fort. He could see the heads of the defenders, topped with conical caps, desperately trying to aim their antiquated matchlocks, which were fired not with a trigger, but by holding a slow-burning wick over the touch hole. Then all of a sudden, the advance stopped. "Prepare to fire," shouted Captain Mee, and the sepoys fell to their knees to prime their muskets. On the next command, the soldiers and sepoys threw up a curtain of fire to cover the sappers who were racing ahead to plant explosives along the breastworks. The respite came as a godsend to Raju. His throat was parched, his nose clogged with dust, his eyes smarting from the smoke. Within seconds, his flask was empty, and when a bhishti appeared, it seemed as if a prayer had been answered. Raju clung to the spout, sluicing water over his face and into his mouth. He would have emptied the masak if Dicky hadn't shouldered him aside. In the distance, at the foot of the hill, down by the water, there was another eruption of flame as the Queen and the Nemesis began a second bombardment, aimed this time not at the fortifications on the hill, but the gun emplacements along the shore. Then came an explosion that silenced everything else. It was the blast of the sappers' charges going off under the breastworks on the hill. When the smoke and debris had cleared, Raju caught a glimpse of Major Pratt, with his saber drawn, racing towards a breach in the walls, followed by a company of Marines. The Banji boys jumped to their feet, expecting that B Company would be the next to charge into the breach. But then suddenly the Fife Major sprang up in front of them. Their orders had changed, he said. Instead of signaling a charge, they were to pipe the sepoys' column into wheeling to the left on the double. What was happening? Were they advancing or retreating? Raju did not know or care. His only thought was of staying in step with the other Banji boys. They were going downhill now, so the pace accelerated steadily until the whole detachment seemed to be running headlong. One by one, the fifers gave up trying to blow on their instruments. There was not enough breath in their lungs. Glimpsing blue waters ahead, Raju realized that they were almost at the bottom of the hill. Then the road made another turn, and they found themselves on an incline that led to the rear of the fort. They saw that the ramparts had crumbled under the bombardment from the two steamers. They saw also that the vessels were still abreast of the battery. The strip of water between them and the shore was filled with the bodies of defendants. Some were still alive, thrashing about helplessly. The sailors on the steamer's decks were picking them off one by one. Kesri was in the first rank when the rear of the fort came into view. He saw that hundreds of Chinese soldiers were pouring out of the gates. He guessed that they were being driven out of the walls by the Marines, who had attacked the shoreside battery after storming down from the hilltop fort. Now the remaining defendants were rushing out to meet the sepoys in a headlong charge. Having endured a bombardment of terrifying intensity, they seemed almost to welcome the prospect of hand-to-hand combat. But the sepoys were prepared for the onrush. Falling to their knees, they met the charge with a barrage of bullets, mowing down the vanguard and causing panic in the ranks behind. And then, with the Chinese front lines already decimated, the sepoys fell upon the milling survivors at close quarters with swords and bayonets. When the two lines collided, the shock reverberated through the column. The pace slowed so abruptly that Raju bumped up against the fifer in front of him. Brought suddenly to a halt, Raju and Dicky stood motionless, fifes hanging uselessly in their hands. All around them, metal was clanging on metal, drowning out the cries of dying men. Slowly, as the carnage unfolded, Raju and Dicky were pushed ahead by the irresistible weight of those behind them. After a few paces, they found themselves stepping over the heaped bodies of slaughtered defenders. Almost without exception, the clothes of the Chinese soldiers were scorched or burned. This was true even of those who were still on their feet. When hit by a bullet or a bayonet, their clothing would burst into flame and they would light up like torches. Suddenly, the Fife Major materialized again within the cloud of smoke. He told Raju and Dicky to get to work, slinging corpses off the road. Tucking their fifes into their belts, they took hold of a pair of lifeless ankles and dragged the corpse to the side of the road, where the hillside sloped into the water a few yards away. As the body rolled down, they noticed that the narrow strip of shore between the road and the channel was filled with the corpses of defenders. They were lying in piles, 2 or 3 deep in some places. Many had rolled into the water. The channel seemed to be full of them, floating like logs. On some, the clothes were still burning. The boys turned abruptly away and went back to the road. As they were taking hold of another corpse, they heard a grunting sound close by and looked up. A few yards ahead, a fallen Chinese soldier had struggled to his feet. His clothes were scorched and his left arm was hanging uselessly at his side, almost severed at the shoulder. In his right hand was a saber, which he raised when his eyes found Raju and Dicky. Pressing up against each other, they froze in shock as the man stumbled towards them, brandishing his sword. Then Dicky found his voice and screamed, "Bachao!" And miraculously, a sepoy emerged from the swirling cloud of dust and bayoneted the man through the stomach. Scarcely pausing to look at the two boys, the sepoy put one foot on the corpse, wrenched out his bayonet, and plunged back into the fray. As Raju's breath returned, he realized that his trousers were wet. He was staring at the dark patch when Dicky said, "Don't worry about it. Happens to everyone, yeah? It'll dry up soon." Glancing at his friend, Raju saw that Dicky's trousers showed a similar stain. Thank you. Thank you.
That was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have to say that I am a fully paid up member of the Amitav Ghosh fan club. I'm fangirl number one.
That's mutual.
And I think that, the tantalizing quality of the Ibis Trilogy is that there is this kind of war and peace like canvas, this huge canvas, and yet these very real situations of real people. And that was a wonderful extract that you read. And, it's interesting, but how many of us even know that Indian sepoys fought in the Opium Wars? Or that there were Parsi businessmen from Bombay who actually financed the Opium Wars. So, is it in some ways also, for you, a kind of, I wouldn't say history from below, but also to sort of illuminate perhaps the many different Indian experiences that existed in the 19th century, which perhaps so few of us really know about.
Yeah, I know, it's extraordinary. I didn't know about it, So if anyone is being illuminated, it's me,
right.
Really.
Yeah.
Because, so many of these experiences are exactly as you say, completely unknown to us.
Right.
So when, say, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh made that speech in China saying, India and China have never fought a war until 1962, it's actually not true at all.
And it's incredible, because you actually bring alive, through personal tragedies, incredible detail to the historical event. Like, for example, in the Sea of Poppies, you have, there's that vivid sequence, I remember, where Diti is looking for her dying husband and she's running through the opium factory.
Yeah.
And you actually then describe every room in the opium factory and the different processes of opium production and how it actually becomes opium. What kind of research do you have to do this?
A lot. But in that case, it was very simple, actually, because, the guy who ran the opium factory, he was a guy called MacArthur, John MacArthur.
Right.
He wrote, he was the manager of the opium factory, and he actually wrote a detailed book about it. It's about 60 or 70 pages. He meant it as a tourist guide. He wanted British tourists to go and visit the opium factory. So, the details are all there. There were extensive paintings. There were paintings done by Indians, paintings done by an Indian artist called Shivalal, a company artist. There were also paintings and etchings done by British artists. Mm-hmm. So the actual sort of visual and historical record is very rich,
Right.
The strange thing, though, was that after Sea of Poppies came out, on my website, I got a letter from a man, and he said, I was the manager of the Ghazipur opium factory until 1969, and your description is completely accurate.
Oh, really?
He said.
And you mentioned that for this particular book, you also had to do a lot of research into military history, because you were actually trying to bring alive the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to do a lot of research, military historical research. It's a very strange thing. You're talking about what, as Indians, we don't really look back at. Mm-hmm. And especially, the 19th century, the British presence here, it was in the first instance a military thing.
Right.
It was a garrison state. The British Raj was a garrison state. It was, And they recognized it repeatedly. They would always say, you know, in internal correspondences between English administrators, they would always say, we are here by the sword. You know, but somehow in our minds it's become translated into something else to do with Jane Austen. You know, so it's a very curious thing. You know, reconstructing this history. I mean, essentially, 19th century Indian history is military history.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's what determined everything.
Right. And how did you fix on the? I mean, did you come to the Opium Wars and, you know, through a process of discovery, how did you decide that I would set my novel in the Ibis Trilogy in this particular period, in this particular historical context?
To be honest, it had nothing to do with Opium Wars or anything. I was, you know, I wanted to write a book about Indians who've left India, you know. And so, you know, the Indian sort of migration really starts in the late 18th century, you can say, because already, you know, in travelogues of Mauritius written in the 1780s, we see already that a lot of the slaves there are actually Indians, especially from Tamil Nadu. But then the real sort of mass migration starts in the 1830s, you know, with the indenture. So I wanted to recreate the experience of the indenture, especially through Diti, who was, to me, a very compelling character.
Yes, she is a very compelling character. Yes. Diti is this gray-eyed woman, and she's Kesri Singh's younger sister. And the relationship between Kesri Singh and her is also very interesting, because they're separated by 6 other siblings or 7 other siblings, but they have that unique bond, and they end up in the end together in a way.
Yes.
In that sense, you know, when you're writing historical fiction, how much of it is wanting to tell the story, or how much of it is wanting to give the information? Because, you know, it could also, I mean, your books are almost like a sort of encyclopedia of 19th century India. You know, the food, the architecture, the language, the weapons of war, the dress, the houses, you know, the way you evoke Shireen's home in Bombay, and the loneliness of that home, and it actually comes alive. You know, Amitav writes about Shireen's building.
That's
in
Behram Modi's
widow, and when she learns about Behram's death, and she's in this mansion and she's lonely, and it's so beautifully evoked.
Well, thank you.
So, where do you draw the line between, you know, all those historical details and the information about the context and the actual story?
I don't know, you know, I mean, there's no rule that one follows.
Right.
You know, my rule is actually, if I have a rule, it's a very simple one, which is that I put in everything that's interesting to me.
Right.
You know, and I just assume that, you know, my reader will also be interested, which is sometimes a wrong assumption. Sometimes they're not interested, but, you know, it interests me in the end. At the end of the day, I'm my own first reader, you know. I have to live with the stuff every day, so.
Yeah. And also, you know, what you say about the Indians who've left India. I mean, those of us who think that India in the 19th century was static and that people never went anywhere and that, you know, we were mostly all closeted away in our different, in our separate communities. No, we were traveling, we were going everywhere, we were going to Mauritius, we were going to China, we were going to all kinds of places. So that was also an incredibly globalized universe.
You're talking about the 19th century, when, yes, all of that is true, but actually, you know, that picture that we have of India being a very settled place, I don't think it's ever been true. Because, you know, you look from about the, you know, from about the 12th century onwards, India was a country absolutely churning, you know, I mean, with invasions, with populations fighting each other. In any case, in India, there's always been a lot of internal migration, you know, because of the dhams, because people have always been traveling to the dhams, you know. You know, the great centers of Puri and so on. So that has been a sort of pattern of migration. For Muslims, it was coming to Ajmer, it was coming to Nizamuddin Aulia, and so on, you know. So there's always been a lot of internal movement because of, say, religious reasons. But it was military most of all, because, you know, even these Madras native infantry soldiers, most of them were Biharis.
Right.
And that's an extraordinary thing. Until 1857, the great bulk of India's soldiery were Biharis. Bihari, Rajputs, and Bhumihars and Brahmins. You know, it was after 1857 that Bihar was completely erased from the map of from the British military map. But, you know, this idea that we have that the soldiers, of British soldiers were mainly North Indians, is completely wrong.
Right, right.
I mean, you know, the North Indian soldiers came on board only after the British Empire had already won
the
all
so-called
its
martial communities ideas that we have.
Yeah, I mean, actually, they only came on board after all the major battles had been won.
By the Biharis.
By the Biharis.
Okay,
It was
how
the
many proud
Biharis,
Biharis
and,
in the audience?
it was Bihari and Tamil soldiers, you know, who basically all the critical battles of the British Empire were fought by Biharis and Madras soldiers.
Right.
I mean, the most.
You know, we really, there's so much of this that we actually really don't know.
I know.
We really don't know any of this. I had no idea that Parsis were funding opium wars in China. I mean, hello? No, I had no idea. But you know, and is this a sort of history from below? Is that your idea to sort of look at people who history books don't write about? I mean, is that the sort of, you know?
I don't know if you'd call it below or above or wherever. But the one thing I know after having written all these books is that everything we read in our history books is basically rubbish. You know, the vision that they give us of the past, a lot of it, what I was taught, you know, it's tangential to, you know, many of the things that were really happening. You know, it's so strange. I mean, there's such an erasure of so many important things that were happening in India.
You mean the actual sort of movement of people, or what was really changing people's lives?
See, I'll give you a simple example. For example, this whole idea that we have about castes being very settled and so on. You know, if you look, in fact, even from the 15th, 16th, 17th century onwards, a lot of the people who were becoming Rajputs were actually people who were, say, from Bundelkhand. They had no particular caste origin, but by joining armies, by joining the military labor market, they translated themselves into Rajputs, you know.
Oh, I see.
And the same thing happened with Muslims, you know. A lot of Muslims who would join the army would thereafter reinvent themselves as Afghans. You know, so this happened constantly. There was this constant churning.
So the caste system was it was hardly fixed. It was just going up in a just fluid kind of grid.
Look, I think it's, the caste system, if you ask me, was something like the ideal of equality in America and Britain today.
Right,
I mean, they're as far from equality as, you know, as caste was in those days. So I think caste was something, may have been an aspirational ideal. But whether it was actually on the ground, we don't know, because
no idea.
You know what the situation was, we don't know, because the military was the critical critical institution, and in the military, you know, people from the hill areas joined, lots and lots of different varieties of people joined, and thereafter, you know.
And they invented identities in the military.
Absolutely.
How interesting is that?
But you know, it's not just them. Even the British. If you look at you know, most of India's prominent families or educated families, how did they get educated? It was basically because they had some relative who was either a soldier or a camp follower. Right. So say all the accountants for the army were kayasts from Bihar, you know. So a lot of them, that was their road to mobility, you know. I mean,
so 19th century India was fundamentally shaped by the military.
Completely.
Completely shaped by
why
the
does
military.
Why does Punjab have canals? I mean, you know,
and the British war efforts.
Why did Bihar become an underdeveloped state? Bihar is the beating heart of this country for 2 millennia. You know, it produced all the wealth, all the thought, all the empires. Why did it suddenly just fall into such decrepitude in the late 19th century? It was because the British just decided to, you know, run this place into the ground, to punish them essentially for 1857.
Right. And also, you know, the sort of East-West encounter, again, we're used to thinking about that in very sort of static terms of foreigners coming and the Indian reaction to them. But it was all much more melded together. If you look at the experience of Zachary, which you describe, I mean, Zachary is an American, he lives in Calcutta, he's part of the, of the Ibis crew. I mean, so even the East-West encounter, the way we think about it, is not sort of the two monolithic kind of cultures and a clash of civilizations or anything like that. It's much more people-to-people contact at many different levels.
Absolutely. See, if you read Herman Melville's, one of his early novels called Redburn, which is actually about his own experiences. Calcutta occurs in the first 10 pages like about 10 times, because, I mean, every sailor who had to come to Calcutta at some point, Right. But, even if we go further back than that, the Armenian community has been in Calcutta
Right.
since the 17th century.
Right.
Or, you look at, see, we often think that Indians were slow to adopt technology. That's not the case at all. We see with the Bahmani kingdoms in the south, in the early modern India, 16th, 17th century, they were absolutely on track with Europe in terms of, say, the structure of fortifications. They adopted all sorts of fortifying techniques. They were absolutely on the front ranks. There's not even a 10-year gap between the introduction of those techniques in Italy and their adoption in India.
So the Bahmani would have got it from Italy?
The Bahmanis were at that particular point of time perhaps the most advanced military. Similarly, the Marathas were not slow to respond. I mean,
Right.
in the 17th century, they were hiring French officers. They were hiring all sorts of mercenary officers and trying to get them to train their armies.
So westernization, the so-called westernization which so many of us fear, and there is a kind of culture of fear of westernization and things coming from the West. This has been in India for hundreds of years.
Absolutely.
Hundreds of years.
I think in many ways one of the things that, see, the critical battle in Indian history was not it was not Plassey, it was not Buxar, it was the Battle of Assaye, in 1805 when the Maratha Confederation.
The Battle of Vasai.
Assaye.
Assaye.
A-S-S-A-Y-E.
Right, okay. How many has heard the Battle of Assaye? Okay, we all know Panipat, right? No.